Well, welcome. Good afternoon to the SETI Institute in downtown Mountain View, California. My name is Simon Steele. I'm the Senior Director of Education here. And talking today is a guest, back again, Dr. Jeff Bennett, who is an astrophysicist and an educator. And he has a bit of a connection with the Institute because usually the person sitting in this chair is Dr. Seth Shostak, our senior astronomer. And between you, you have created a Life in the Universe textbook, which if there are any questions about that, we can certainly answer that. I've used it teaching a course before, so it's a very, very good. I'll get it signed at the end, even though it's a very, very old edition. So we are going to talk about a subject close to your heart and something that you're traveling around at the moment giving talks and presentations on, which is the subject of global warming, and which is outlined in this book that you have out, Global Warming Primer. And we're going to talk a little bit about that and the subject of this, which is you refer to as global warming demystified. So I suppose, first of all, you are an astrophysicist. Why is an astrophysicist suddenly or interested in global warming? Tell us about this.
Well, first off, thank you very much for having me here today. I'm afraid I'm not as funny as Seth is, so the audience will have to forgive that
there'll
part.
be very few jokes today. I guess there's going to be somber.
I let him handle all the jokes when we're working together. This is actually an astronomical topic because I wouldn't say necessarily we first learned about it, but we learned a lot about this topic of global warming from comparative planetary studies, in particular of Venus, but also other planets and moons with atmospheres have a greenhouse effect. So we learn a lot about this topic through the study of astronomy. And as a result of that, it's something I've been teaching about in my astronomy courses for almost 40 years now. And also something we write about in our Life in the Universe course because of its connections to the question of how do civilizations survive, since every civilization would probably reach a point where they would face a problem of this type, if not this exact same problem.
Right, and that's a good tie-in here with the SETI Institute. Many of the listeners will be familiar with the Drake equation, which asks the question of how many intelligent communicating civilizations are there in the galaxy. Not an easy question to answer because we have so few data points yet. But one of those terms at the end is once you get to a position where you can have the technology to communicate with other star systems, other planets, how long does that last? And that comes down to the point, as you say, you've got such an advanced society, but there are negatives with that. There's a price to that sometimes.
The same technology that allows you to start communicating in principle with other civilizations and traveling out into space is going to necessarily involve creating technologies that can, if not used well, lead to problems from nuclear war to global warming and various other things that could cause a catastrophe. My favorite quote from H.G. Wells 100 years ago is, "Human history becomes more and more a race between education and catastrophe."
And that race, if there's whether it's a sprint or a marathon, you could say that the finish line is maybe coming into view.
Well, that's right, and I think that's where it does get back to SETI. If civilizations commonly win that race and keep moving forward, then there will be a lot of them that we could in principle communicate with. And if they tend to lose that race, then there wouldn't be so many.
So the question is, where does the data point of humanity sit? And that's something we'll maybe come across. If you do have any questions or comments, please do write in. We have our Director of Communications, Rebecca, who is going to be responding to you online. But any questions you have for Jeff, please do write them down or send them in the comments message on Facebook, and we will attempt to answer those questions. So please do join in the conversation. Actually, one question, first of all, the global warming and climate change, these are two terms that are used interchangeably now. Is it okay to use them interchangeably, and why is one more popular than the other?
So global warming, when you say that term, you're speaking basically in terms of the global average temperature rising. Not every place on Earth is going to have its temperature rise by the same amount. So for that reason, some scientists prefer the term climate change to indicate that what's happening is you're causing the climate to change and locally and in different regions. From my point of view, they're basically interchangeable depending on whether I'm talking about the regional effects, climate change, or the global effects of the planet warming up.
Right, and then there's another term. I family in upstate New York, and it is snowing there and it is freezing. So there's no evidence of global warming in Rochester. But there you're talking about weather. You're talking about a much more localized short-term situation. How do you distinguish it, between weather and climate change?
So the technical point of distinguishment is weather is short-term changes and climate is the long-term average of weather, whether regionally or globally. But one of the misconceptions that goes along with that is with a warming climate overall, you are essentially putting more energy into the climate system. There's more total energy, more heat in the oceans and the atmosphere than there used to be. That's what global warming is doing. And you know that it's energy and heat that drives storms. So one of the predicted consequences that we are indeed seeing of global warming is more extreme weather events. And a winter storm is an extreme weather event. So the idea that we might see some more severe winter storms is actually completely consistent with global warming. When you add in some of the effects going on in the Arctic, which suggests that may be affecting the jet stream and bringing more winter weather into the eastern United States in particular, while causing the other parts of the Arctic, Alaska, to get record warm temperatures, the Arctic to warm much more than it has before. So to say that snowing is counter to global warming is a misconception.
Oh, right. So that's why maybe climate change is a good term, isn't it, in some ways, because it's having a much larger dump of snow in an area is actually a symptom of this increased energy in the atmosphere. Yes, but not necessarily. And of course, that's the subtlety, isn't it? Because we've had hurricanes and we've had storms and floods since the beginning of recorded history. So so I think what's different now.
So what we see, there is that more energy. So you would expect there to be either more events or more severe events, or both, for these extreme weather events. And the data show very clearly that that is indeed happening. There are more extreme weather events occurring around the world than there were in decades past. Now, it can be subtle, as you said, because these events happen anyway, but what global warming tends to do to them is possibly make them more frequent and make them stronger. It increases the odds of getting a particularly bad event. A lot of climate scientists like to use what they call the loaded dice analogy, that it's still kind of random, but climate change is loading the dice. What we're doing to the atmosphere is loading the dice and making the extreme events more likely than they were before.
Okay, and it's what has been a sort of long-term change, and it's like one of these things that you don't really notice. Maybe we have a hurricane here, we have a flood here, but until you look at a large time scale, it's only then when you realize, I suppose, that you are skewing.
Well, you have to.
The data.
The data aren't easy to collect, so you have to collect them carefully to really see the trend of the number and the severity. Interestingly enough, it turns out that the best data on extreme weather events comes from insurance companies. Because they obviously have a vested financial interest in the Global Warming Primer, which incidentally the book is also posted for free online at globalwarmingprimer.com. And you can see the graph that's been compiled that shows very clearly that the number of extreme events is increasing.
Right. We'll have a link to the website and the book. So if anyone's interested, just go onto the SETI website, and we'll direct you to the link there, so people can have a look at their leisure at the data and the information there. So that's interesting. So insurance companies, it's amazing where you can get some data points. For this.
Yes.
Yeah. When does global warming, climate change is so much a part of the language now. When did those terms? When did it first break the surface, if you like.
Well, I don't know when the terms really broke the surface, but I know I went to my undergraduate at the University of California, San Diego, where Charles David Keeling and Roger Revelle had first started making the measurements that showed the increasing carbon dioxide. So in the 70s, when I was there, I already was well aware of this problem and this topic. And I looked back at my notes from the first time I taught astronomy in 1982 when I was covering it in my class there. I think it really hit the national radar in 1988 when James Hansen testified before Congress saying, this is real, it's happening, and we need to do something. And I think it hit the global radar, and this is going to shock people, when a major political leader spoke about it at the United Nations in 1989. And the part that's going to shock people is who it was. It was Margaret Thatcher. So I like to point that out, that when people think that global warming has some sort of political divide to it, particularly thinking it might be some sort of liberal thing, that Margaret Thatcher, founder of modern conservatism, was the first major global leader to say, this is real, it's us, and it's a problem, and we need to do something about it.
Yeah. And that sort of leads us, hopefully not down the path of politics and everything, but I think you've got a quote from Ronald Reagan as well, saying that this isn't a left or right agenda here. This is something that affects us all. This is a common sense problem,
Correct.
if you like.
Yeah, Ronald Reagan wasn't speaking specifically of global warming, but of the environmental movement in general. He said, no, this is common sense. We need to protect the environment and make it better for our children and grandchildren. It's not liberal or conservative.
Yeah,
yes.
yeah. This talk ties in quite nicely because there was an announcement this week, 11,000 scientists around the world. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, there were not much more beyond the newspaper headline, but saying that this is really an urgent situation. I think it's great to have that statement put out, although it is, again, because climate scientists have been telling us this for decades at this point. But I think there's an opportunity to listen more for us, for those who are in policy positions, the voting public, in part because of this wonderful movement that has started among young people to call attention to this. Because I was at a middle school just yesterday talking to the kids, and it's really interesting when you're talking to them to realize when you hear people talking about the consequences of global warming, you usually hear them talking about what might happen by 2030 or 2050. In 2050, those kids are still going to be young. They won't even be halfway through their lives. And we're not even very rarely talking about the further consequences down the line, and their lives depend on this for a long time to come here.
Yeah, that's interesting. And one thing I did like about your book is your letter to your grandchildren, because this is a long-term effect, as you say. We've had crises before. I remember growing up during the nuclear crisis in the late 70s, early 80s, which seemed to be much more of an imminent. There was the sort of Damocles, was dangling for everyone to see. It's interesting that this is, in a sense, a subtle effect when you go from year to year, but it's a cumulative effect.
Correct. It's a more difficult effect. If you see a nuclear bomb explosion, it's pretty easy to go, oh, that would be bad. It's a little harder to see this because it does accumulate slowly. But I will point out, going back to the letter to the grandchildren idea, I like to point out that you have a tendency, particularly listening to the news media, to think that Americans are polarized on everything. So what can you come up with that we're not polarized on? And one thing you can come up with is that from far left to far right, everyone agrees that they would like a better world for their kids and their grandkids. So I think if everyone starts thinking, what will my grandchildren say about what I did today? Maybe we get everybody to get on board and act.
Yeah. So are there, as the question comes out, are there any positives that come out of global warming? People talk about the opening of the Northwest Passage, the availability of more, resources available from under the ice. So, are we sort of, is there a little bit of a positive going on here, or are we just just
It's
fooling
only
ourselves.
positive if you think that getting brain cancer means more brain cells. Yes, but overall, it's hugely negative.
Yeah.
No, there's, the opening of the Arctic Ocean is actually a very worrisome amplifying effect because the ice reflects a lot of sunlight, the water absorbs it, and so having less ice means we're actually amplifying all the other effects of global warming. So from my perspective, while you could in isolation maybe say, oh, we could take advantage of this one thing, yes, except for that there's 10 more negative things piled on top of that. So I would say there are 0 positives to this at all.
I'm just playing devil's advocate here. So I suppose, what can we do? This is the question, and that's a question for a global response, and it's also a question for an individual response. Obviously, people need to live. People have to have jobs, and get through the next 10 years and whatever is going on in their lives.
Right.
But what small things can be done, do you think?
Well, so when you look at this problem in general, there's sort of the simple part of it and the complex part of it. The simple part of it is that in principle, this is like the easiest problem to solve there is, because we know exactly what's causing it. What's causing it primarily is the burning of fossil fuels. So the solution is simple, just stop doing that. The complex part is, yes, we like our lights and our Facebook lives and all these kinds of things. So we can't just get rid of those fossil fuels unless we replace them with something else. But we already have the technology to replace them, to have just as much energy, in fact, at lower cost, without the consequences. And the 3 technologies that can replace them are efficiency, so you can do the same benefits with less energy, renewables like wind and solar, and nuclear, which does not emit any greenhouse gases. And between those 3, if we felt strongly enough about it, if we had like a World War II mentality when we had to suddenly react, in 3 to 5 years we could replace all fossil fuels with some combination of those 3 things. Problem solved. Still plenty of energy. And so when it comes to the solution, I think what we need is policies that incentivize that change. And my personal favorite is the one advocated by a group called the Citizens Climate Lobby and by a group of former Republican officials led by George Shultz, who I was very lucky to actually meet this morning for the first time. And that is what's called the tax and dividend plan. You put on a tax on carbon emissions, but the government doesn't keep the revenue. It returns it all to taxpayers in the form of dividends. So it separates that financial aspect of incentivizing better fuels from the separate aspect of whether you want the government to collect tax money, because the government doesn't, in this case, get to keep any of it.
And so this is sort of taxing bad behavior or bad habits in a way. Yeah.
Although it's, I actually would say that there's a stronger case for it. It's not just taxing a bad habit, it's taxing something that's unfairly subsidized. If you look at various studies that have been done, including by conservative economists, the total subsidies for fossil fuels in the United States are probably on order of $1 trillion per year. If we were paying those costs directly in the price, no one would be buying fossil fuels already, because nuclear, wind, solar would all be cheaper. So you're in a sense correcting a market distortion when you put on that carbon tax.
And maybe some money then to support the communities, obviously, that rely on fossil fuel creation,
right?
Because again, these are communities that are affected very intimately by this global issue.
Yeah, the economics are always very difficult to foresee. Most of the economists that I've read, both conservative and Republicans, believe that overall we'd actually have just as many jobs, just in different areas of energy. But there would be certain communities that would obviously get hurt, and so it's important to enact policies to make sure that those people are helped along the way.
What areas of there's so many different areas that this is affecting globally. Is there any particular area that interests you most and that you look out for most? Is it the glaciers? Is it the sort of sea level rise? Obviously everything is linked, but
which area, which type of consequences most important to you is going to depend probably on where you live and so on. Here in California, wildfires are probably one of the biggest concerns. Near sea level along the coast, you've got the effects of sea level rise. You know, in warm parts of the world, India, the Middle East, just the mere warming that's going on is making heat waves far worse and so on.
Yeah. So whatever's on your own,
yes,
in your own backyard.
But I think again, I don't think there's any place that's actually benefiting.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we do have. Oh, we have no questions yet. No questions yet. But I am going to say hello to is that and this is a long name and I'm bound to get it wrong. From Kristiansand in Norway, Evan Stokadalen. So Evan, and I'm looking at the wrong camera. Evan, I hope you're enjoying the discussion, and if you do have any questions, please let us know, because this is something our audience is generally global, and this is probably the global question and discussion that everybody should be invested in.
Absolutely, and it is the recent marches that the young people held were all around the world. You probably saw photographs from places that you might be surprised to see people marching, like Afghanistan, China, Iraq.
Yeah, because people, obviously there are other issues that people have to deal with for day-to-day survival, and you know, when it becomes strong enough that this is they have time to take action on this,
that's
you know that it's very, very serious.
But this one is, and it's really coming up on us fast, and we do have many, many problems around the world that we need to solve, but I would argue we better get our handle on this one first so that we have time to solve all the rest before we, you know, we won't drive ourselves to extinction, but before we lose basically the prosperity that we enjoy today.
Tell me about when you teach as an educator. You go into schools and different environments. What sort of interaction, what sort of questions do you get? What sort of concerns do you get from all ages, but mainly from young people?
Well, I think first of all, and especially with the young people, what I want to do is make sure they understand the basic science of this topic, because I think they understand that it's happening. And that's why young people are, in general, very, very concerned about this. But when some grown-up goes to them and says, well, I don't believe it, they don't know how to respond, because they don't know the science behind it. They just know they see it and it's going on around the world. So I want them to be able to respond and say, here's how we know that this is a real issue. But I think the other thing is, they want to know what they can do about it. There's a lot of fear, and I think we need to talk about what happens if we solve this problem, because I think that's the part that we miss out too much on. So people tend to think, okay, we got a big problem. If we solve it, we'll be right where we are now. And I would argue that it's not quite that, because think about what happens if we solve this problem. Well, then we can keep investing, research, doing all the things we're doing. And to take one of my favorite examples, nuclear fusion, which would be basically unlimited clean energy. Now, we don't know how to do that yet, but 50 years from now, if I had a bet, we'll have it. So now ask yourself, what would you do? What could we do with unlimited clean energy? There'd be no more poverty in the world. There'd be no more freshwater problems. We wouldn't have to mine mountaintops because we'd go to the moon or an asteroid to get it. The future for young people is quite amazing if we can get past where we are today and solve this problem. So I think getting young people to understand it's not a choice between bad and okay, it's a choice between bad and great.
Yeah. So this is the end of global warming, or the end of human contributions to global warming, is in fact a new beginning, rather than the end of a problem, is what you're saying. That's right. I mean, so we should look at it in that sort of positive light.
Yes, and to bring it back to the SETI connection, if we can get through this period of time, we will have the energy sources that will allow us to really begin to certainly become an interplanetary civilization, and perhaps someday an interstellar one.
Yeah. Yeah, I think sometimes you hear, oh, you know, there's problems on the Earth, and but you know, we're building up the possibility of colonies on the moon, and the first steps in sending humans to Mars and treating Mars as a lifeboat in a way to a failing Earth. What are your thoughts on that as an astronomer?
So the idea of Mars as a lifeboat, I'm not particularly excited about, because I think we should, it's almost fatalistic, presuming we're going to wreck this place. Let's fix this place. But the idea of Mars as a destination where we're going to have research stations, search for life, do all kinds of amazing things, that I'm very, very much in favor of. And I think, again, it's the analogy that I like to use is if you have a teenager who's misbehaving, the solution to that problem is not to lock them in a closet and say, come out when you've decided to be better. The solution is to show them the advantages of fixing their behavior and how that will give them a great future. And so if we want human civilization, young people in particular, to solve today's problems and be able to move forward, we have to show them where we could end up going. And to me, space travel and exploration is one great example of, look what we'll be able to do if we can solve the problems.
Right, because these are things to look forward to when other things are in place. Yes, yeah. And as you say, the current generation in kindergarten are the ones who, on the negative side, are going to feel the burden of climate change, but also reap the benefits of how humans have used their technology and their skills, their intellect to actually break through this serious issue, almost like the eradication of a disease.
Right.
And then to come out the other side.
Coming out the other side, that's the key. With the elementary kids, I usually read from my book, Max Goes to the Moon, in which at the end there's a lunar colony, including the University of the Moon, and I ask them, who would like to go to college on the moon? And almost every hand goes up. You don't have kids who don't think that would be cool.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know if I'd want to go. Maybe I'm just too old for that.
Spring break on the moon. It's only a 2-day trip, right?
That's true, yes. Yep, that's fast. Oh, we have a question coming in using new technology. At the bottom. Okay, thank you. Do individual actions actually contribute to change, or is it really only based upon Paris Agreement types of actions? I suppose you want to maybe just say a little bit about what the Paris Accord is before you tackle that.
Well, the Paris Accords, which currently the U.S. is supposedly going to try to pull out of, which is a mistake, but the Paris Accords are an attempt to get a global agreement on how to address this problem. They don't go far enough, but you got to start somewhere. As far as individual actions go, the cumulative damage that's going on in the environment is the actions of 7 billion people, with some of those people causing more of it than others, the more prosperous, and particularly in the United States. So whatever you can do individually to reduce your personal impact is definitely going to help. But as the Paris Accords represent, global warming is a global problem that's going to require global policy changes to completely solve. So I would say, beyond just doing what you can individually, the most important individual thing you can do is make sure that when you vote, you are voting for policies or people who will enact policies that will address this globally.
Yeah, because as a global problem, it is actually, you see it in movies like Independence Day, where nobody's getting on, but you get this external threat of alien invasion or something, and that brings people together. It's these conditions of adversity that really show the human spirit and bringing people together.
Yes.
And in a sense, that's climate change is something that unites everybody on this planet. And it, if you're going to say, is there any good in climate change? No, there isn't, but in a sense there is. It's this
the silver lining. If we come together and solve it, yes. I think that's actually a very important point. Again, to bring back the SETI connection, one of the questions that comes up a lot is, can civilizations ever get past the point where they're subject to destroying themselves? And my answer to that would be, I believe if we can go another 50 to 100 years, the only way we will make it that far is if we've come together as a globe, created political and social structures that actually make it sort of impossible for us to kill each other off. And so this could be the thing that actually triggers a ability to survive for the long term.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, we're actually coming to the end of our time. We have time for one more question. This is from Frank Eskandel. I'm not sure where you're from, but please, you're listening. How is global warming related to SETI's mission? You know, you're sitting here in the SETI Institute, you're an astronomer, we're talking about climate change. How does that all tie together?
I think it comes right back down to that. Are there others? SETI is the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. And the only intelligence we can communicate with is civilizations that survive. And so understanding whether it's possible to solve this problem is critical to understanding whether it's possible for other civilizations to solve what must be the same type of problem that they face. So by finding out whether we can do this, we automatically learn more about whether others can as well, and more about the possibility that other civilizations are out there.
Right, we are the unwitting lab rats of the last term in the Drake equation.
Yes,
in a way.
Exactly.
Well, thank you everyone for listening. I hope you enjoyed this. Thanks to Jeff for speaking to us. We'll put in the links to his website and his book, and also some references to NASA that have wonderful information on this very, very important subject. So we'll sign off. Thank you very much.
Thank you.